Good morning, everyone. Today we're going to work on spinal roll, working through rolling patterns of the spine. I like to really focus on low back mobility because generally most people have a lot of tension in that low back, lack that ability to get good pelvic mobility due to that stiffness in the low back. So I want to get that back moving a little bit better to get further into our spinal rolls, which can be a really fun movement if we get really good at them. So let's get started. We're going to start on our back. I want to go through a couple of different breath exercises before we get into our movement. So we're going to start with our crocodile breath, making our big C shapes with our hands, placing our hands below the rib cage, right above the pelvis, the hip bone, getting into that nice meaty space underneath the ribs and above the hips, and kind of pressing in and squeezing. And I want to feel that index finger pressing into the front of the abdominals, the side palm pressing into the side body, and then the thumb pressing into the low back. We'll start with taking some nice deep breaths in through the nose and out through the mouth. As we inflate into the nose, as we fill up, feel the abdominal walls pressing out into all 6 of those points of contact: index finger, side palm, and thumb. I want to feel expansion in that, like a balloon expanding out in all directions through the abdominal space on the inhale. And then on the exhale, drawing the navel all the way into the spine. As you're exhaling, allow your hands to kind of lightly squeeze so that you can give yourself some resistance on your inhale. And then inflate, intentionally inflating, feeling that pressure, pushing the fingers out. Notice if you're having difficulty filling up one particular area of space through the abdominal walls. Especially, like, is it harder on one side? Is it harder to fill into the back or the side, into that thumb or the side of the palm? Continue to take these nice full breaths in. We're going to move our hands. We're going to lift the feet off the floor, bringing our knees tucked in. We're going to spread the knees out wide, but keep the feet lightly touching together. You're going to place your hands on your knees, pulling your knees actively into your hands and actively pushing into your knees so that you're creating some tension through the abdominal core. And we're going to continue with that same crocodile breath. But I want to maintain active tension pulling in through the knees, as well as active tension pushing through the hands. And see if you can continue to feel that expansion out through the abdominal walls. Also notice if you can feel some breath moving down into the pelvic floor. I don't want to get too focused on that. Just kind of notice if you feel that action with your breath. We'll give you 5 to 6 breaths. You may notice that with that tension, it feels a little bit harder to expand into that balloon, which is fine. You just want to kind of continue to work that neurology. We'll go ahead and let our legs go nice and flat. We're going to get into a little bit of really light baby roll. Bring arms up to our Y position so that the elbows are kind of nice and rested on the floor. Continuing to breathe into that crocodile breath. On the inhale, feel that expansion. On the exhale, drawing navel into spine. And if you have any kind of low back pain, then I want to move into these next parts very, very slowly, paying attention, making sure that we don't move into a painful position. We're just simply going with our reach across, reaching as if there's something over here I want to grab, kind of like I'm trying to roll over from my back to my belly, but I want to keep my foot in contact with the ground, so I'm just seeing how far can I roll without losing that foot. Inhale, coming back to center. Exhale, reaching across to the other side. And with each reach, I'm seeing if I can, how far can I get fingertips away from toe tips? That foot that's on the ground, I'm trying to also reach away and draw out traction from fingertip to toe tip as I exhale. Inhale, bringing it back. Exhale, getting nice and long. And so we're going side to side. Notice if this is a little easier, reaching with the left hand than with the right hand. Also notice, where do you feel the stretch on the right side compared to the left side? Is one side a little tighter, a little stiffer, a little bit more uncomfortable? We want to make sure we're not moving into pain. My right side low back, as I'm reaching across with my right hand, is a little bit tighter. This is kind of my normal tension pattern. We'll come back up to our starting position, and now we're going to do the same thing, reaching from the leg. Keeping hand or some part of the upper body in contact with the floor. The shoulder blade is allowed to lift as we reach and extend those toes. Again, keep it small to start with. Make sure that you're not moving into pain. Continuing to keep that crocodile breath. Inhale when you come to center. Exhale, drawing the navel in as you reach and extend. As you're feeling the ability to get a little longer on each one, you can start to reach away through the fingertips. Trying to get fingertip and toe tip as far away from each other as possible. Again, notice, how does this feel different on the left side compared to the right side? Then we're going to flip over onto our belly, bringing arms all the way up to the ears. I want to keep elbows really tight to the ears. We're going to lift up through the arms. I don't want the arm coming away from my head. It's almost as if I'm trying to touch my elbow to my ear. And I'm actually going to kind of look into my corner of my eye and lift that elbow up towards the ceiling. And I'm going to lift until it starts to roll my shoulders over. And I'm only rolling as far as I can, keeping my knee in contact with the floor. I don't want my hip to roll over, so I lose touch of the knee. So exhale as we reach. Inhale, come back to center. Same thing on the other side. Keep that elbow tight to the ear. As you're lifting up and rolling, it's okay if your knee and your hip bend a little bit and that knee slides upwards, as long as it is staying in contact with the floor. And then just slide it back down as you come back to your belly. We're slowly seeing if we can extend a little bit further on each one. If that's feeling pretty good, as you're reaching and rotating, even with that knee slightly bending, you can then start to reach away through the toes, getting long from fingertip to toe tip as you're getting that nice roll. And comparing the difference, right side to the left side. In this particular movement for me, my left shoulder is much stiffer. I can move pretty freely through my right. My left side feels stiff and a little, it's right on the border of pain. I would actually put it at a level of discomfort. Then we're going to let our arms slide straight out to the side with the palms down. This next one, I want to be really cautious. We're going to get into some good spinal mobility, but I don't want to overmove it. I want to stay very small and safe, making sure it's not painful. So fingers are out, bending one knee, lifting that foot up towards the ceiling. Then you're going to lift that knee up like you're trying to touch your heel to the ceiling. And then letting your hip rotate over like you're trying to touch your foot to the floor, but you're only going as far as you can without your shoulder lifting up. Inhale, bring it back down to center, switching to the other side. Start with a light lift, reach that heel, light rotation, making sure that this is not painful. And as you slowly explore the space, you can start to see if you can move a little further into it, as long as you're staying soft and non-forceful. Continue to use your breath as a part of the movement. Exhale as you reach. Inhale as you bring it back to center. I want to make sure that we're not holding breath. If you find that you're reaching to a point and you feel tension in your breath, holding the breath, then you're going a little bit too far. I want to have nice, smooth access to breath. Then we're going to come up into a V-sit. So we're going to be working spinal rolls, but one of the biggest things with spinal rolls is kind of loosening up the relationship between the hips and the low back. Because that low back can be stiff, and a lot of the reason the low back is stiff is because it's coupled to some tight hips. So we want to get mobility in both the hips and the low back, and largely in how they interrelate with each other. So we're going to work, starting out, we're kind of getting into the hips to get the hips, especially the deep hip rotators, getting those guys moving a little bit better. So from our V-sit, nice wide sit, actively reach the knees down towards the floor, actively reach the heels out, away as if they're trying to slide towards the walls, and actively pulling the dorsum of the foot back, like you're trying to fold your foot to your shin. Your hands can come down as support as long as we're spiraling the elbows out and opening up the chest. And from here, paying attention to the kneecaps. How far out can you rotate them? How far in can you rotate? I want to know to focus on the kneecaps and not the feet, because I can spiral my kneecaps only so far. I can reach a lot farther with just the feet. So if I'm paying attention to the foot, I may not notice that I'm moving a lot more at my ankle, but I'm not moving rotationally from my hip. So I want to kind of notice the kneecaps so that I can compare right side to left side. Do they rotate outwardly as far, and do they rotate inwardly as far? What you may find is that one side rotates better to the external and the other side rotates better to the internal. That's going to create a spiral pattern in one direction that's going to spiral through the hips, and that will spiral all the way up to the spine, which will create some interesting, I would say, scoliotic patterns in the spine. As we're getting into this, now I want to start to free the ankles, and we're going to do a little bit of that ankle flossing. So as we rotate out, we can point the toes. You can even start to flex the toes, crunching them in. But if you have any kind of imbalance in the foot, you might find that that produces a little bit of a Charlie horse. So I want to kind of avoid that if we can. As we pull back, spread the toes, open up the knuckles as wide as you can. Point, flex as we come all the way through. I want to feel that nice flossing action around the ankle joint. It should feel really good. After we do 5 or so in one direction, then we're going to reverse directions and do the same thing. Notice if this feels different on one side. Does one foot feel tighter, stiffer, especially as you point and flex? Do you feel a Charlie horse action more on one side than you do on the other? Next, we're going to bring hands up. I want to continue to keep that active knees down, pulling the dorsum of the foot back, taking in our nice crocodile breath, and on our exhale, we get a little forward fold and just slightly reach forward. On the inhale, coming back. And moving in and out with each one, seeing if you can reach a little further without forcing it. How does this feel through the hamstrings, through the back of the legs? Do you feel this more on one side than you do on the other? As we're kind of getting into it, noticing that difference, start to deviate. Reach a little bit more towards the right side and a little bit more towards the left side. Again, getting in that awareness of, does it feel different on one side than it does on the other? My right hamstring tends to be a little tighter, a little stiffer. I got pretty good range of motion. And really, if anything, I'd say I have less range of motion going to my left, largely because of my right side low back. So I feel tighter through my hamstring, but I reach further. I feel less tightness on my left side. I don't reach as far. It's the reasons I want to kind of pay attention to this stuff, because my right hamstring feels tight. It might make me want to stretch it more, but if I'm looking at my range of motion, I actually have better range of motion, which means that it might be the left side that actually needs more work, because it doesn't have the ability to get me to a point where I even feel it stretching. All right, now we're going to change into our frog position. Getting nice and wide with the knees, but feet are coming in close together. On palms, arms extended, coming back into our belly breath. Into the nose, out through the mouth. On the exhale, softly letting the hips sink back to the heels. Inhale, bringing it forward. I want to feel this in those, deep in that hip socket. With each one, we're seeing if we can sink in a little deeper. Notice if one hip feels tighter. You feel it tighter, especially through that adductor space on one side compared to the other. You can even do a little bit where you're just kind of like lightly rotating through the hips, letting one hip drop down and the other hip drop down, just to get a little bit more mobility in there and to assess a little bit more. My left hip is tighter getting into this than my right hip. However, whenever I get into this position and move through these spaces, it tends to improve significantly. If you're feeling pretty good with all that, we can drop down into the elbows, continuing to glide in and out. We can also tuck those back toes just to kind of get a little loading through the foot and see if that changes. That's what we're feeling in the hips. Then we'll walk it back up to our hands. I don't want to be super deep into this movement, but now we're going to work on some spiraling through the hip. Lifting an ankle lightly up towards the ceiling and then bringing it back down, and then doing the same thing on the other side. Going back and forth. Again, this is a great one to kind of notice. How does this feel on the right side compared to the left side? Does one side, are you able to lift your ankle higher compared to the other side? How does it actually feel in the hip? Is one side tighter and more restricted? And is it uncomfortable? We'll make sure it's not painful. Once we're done with that, you can add in a couple more glides forwards and backwards just to kind of come back and assess. Hopefully you're noticing that it's opened that movement up considerably. All right, so getting into shin box, we're only going to work a couple of shin box movements. Let's go ahead and first, though, kind of assess our shin box. I'm on my left side shin box. My left side shin box is generally the easier side, so I want to notice, how do the hips feel? How tall are you able to sit? Do you feel the need to put your hand down on the floor? And then we're going to transition to the other side. And I'm going to give you two transition options. One is both feet on the floor, nice spiral through, maintaining that contact. I don't want to walk my feet. I want to feel, how does that spiraling action move through the hip socket? Is it clunky? I want to be able to do that in both directions. The other option is our thread through, lifting up that back leg, spiraling it around, threading it through, opening up the front leg, and turning it into the back leg. So once we get to the other side, doing the same assessment. How does this side feel compared? This side for me is a little tighter. I feel my inside of my left hip, which I already noted, and I feel my right side low back, which I already noted. They're kind of pulling me to the side a little bit. So I just want to kind of have a notice for that. Although, for the first time, this is my first time getting into shin box today, because of the V-sit and the frog, this already feels a lot better than it normally does, especially at the level of the hip. So, letting our outside hand come down, spiraling that elbow out, opening up the chest. And we're gonna start with our work in that anterior hip. Inside of the knee is a pivot point, reaching that hip bone forward, feeling that light stretch through the front of the hip, and then letting it soften. With each one, seeing if we can move that hip bone forward. This space right here, being able to get full hip extension, is really, really important for our spinal rolls. Because generally what happens is we can't open up this space. We get short here, we stay slightly hip flexed or with an anterior pelvic tilt, which pulls our lower back into its lordotic curve, making it really hard to go into lumbar flexion, which is kind of necessary for our spinal rolls. So if this doesn't move well, you're not going to have much access to the spinal roll. So there's a reason I do this movement quite a bit. We'll go ahead and switch across to the other side. I generally have this part in my shin box every day because this movement is so important. And we're going to do a number of things getting into this space. We're doing it in our shin box. We already did it a little bit with our frog, and we're going to do it in half kneeling as well. So again, pushing through that knee, slide that hip bone forward. Notice the difference one side to the other. This musculature is attaching directly to the anterior spine. If one side is tighter, if one side is more in an anterior tilt, then you're going to have one pelvis pulling in one direction of your spine, which is going to cause your lower spine to kind of deviate a little bit towards that hip, which again is a part of what creates those kind of like scoliotic curves. Hips have a lot to do with that stuff. So I want to notice the imbalances in this way so that I can work on feeding them. We'll go ahead and bring it back to the other side, and now I want to get into our folds in order to get into that glute space. But I want my folds to work both the front of the hip and the back of the hip at the same time. So for right now, knee is the arrow. Both hands come equidistance about around the knee so that I can work on how square can I get my chest to the floor. Can I reach sternum through that knee? Can I reach hands evenly without rotating my thoracic? Can I stay square? Taking a nice deep breath in, exhale, reach a little further. Then we're going to bring it back up, and we'll shin box through to the other side. Again, it can be our thread through, it can be more that windshield wiper. But same thing when we get here, hands on the floor, squaring the chest. Notice if it's harder or easier to get square, reaching the sternum through the knee, reaching the hands, nice deep breath. In and out. And we're going to go back and forth. And we'll spend a couple minutes going back and forth, slowly expanding this position. For right now, notice how does this back hip feel in the position as well as going into our fold. Do you feel stretch and strain in that back hip? How does the front hip, the glute space of that front hip feel? Do you get a decent length and stretch in that glute on one side compared to the other? And then how does your low back feel? Especially while you're trying to maintain that square chest to the floor. Is it harder to do that on one side compared to the other? And as we go back and forth a few times and you're able to get a little bit deeper, then we can start to open up that back knee, moving out of, changing our position. This is going to expose that back hip a little bit more. As I get into my folds, I may be less worried about maintaining that knee, that square sternum to the knee. And I'm just kind of refining that nice length and stretch. I still want to get into my glute space, but I also want to feel into this back hip. I'm trying to get this anterior hip space to be able to lengthen and shorten and move so it's more mobile, so that I can get more movement in my low back for our spinal rolls. And the things that we notice that are different from one side to the other are going to, specifically in this space, especially around that anterior hip, is going to be something that is directly interacting with our low back. So I want to be soft with this stuff. I don't want to force it. I want to notice the differences between sides because those differences are having an impact. But I also want to see if I can get them to balance out just simply by moving through them. We'll continue to open up that back hip until we get into what we would consider more of a yoga class pigeon pose. So for the deeper pose, if you're able to get into this position, if you can't get fully into this position, that's okay. I don't want to force it. But as I get here into this back leg is straight back, now I want to see if I can square both hips to the floor so that I can feel this length through the back hip as well as some stretch through the glute of the front hip. See, and I want to see if I can feel those stretches at the same time. Can you get into a position where you are feeling both glute and length here? It doesn't have to be a major stretch. I just want to feel it getting longer as I work on how low can I get, how much can I reach, comfortable. And then the last thing I want to kind of look at with that, if we can get our hips square, if we can get that back leg reaching back, I want to work on getting this front knee more open. It's real easy to get into these positions and have a closed knee, but that's not going to get a whole lot of stretch through the glute. So I want to bring that knee more open. I want to have close to a 90-degree bend at the knee. It'll help to put a hand at your heel and a hand at your knee, and then to lift up. The knee's allowed to lift up off the floor, get the hips square, and then reach back through that back leg and see how much you can settle both hips, feeling into the front hip as well as the back hip at the same time. I don't expect most people are going to be off the ground here. And it's okay to kind of roll out of it and then to roll into it. This is a really good one to compare. So 90-degree bend, hand at the heel, hand at the knee, lift up to square your body to the floor, slide that bottom leg back like you're trying to reach the toes to the wall behind you, and then feel both hips soften down to the floor. And you feel the stretch in the front of the back hip as well as the glute at the same time. Now do that one 2 or 3 times in a row to really get a good comparison. Now I've had 5 knee surgeries on my right knee. My right hip is generally stiffer. So my right side, I don't get quite as low. I feel more stretch in the front of my left hip. I get a deep, I feel a little bit in my right hip. I also feel a little tug directly at the knee, so I don't want to force that position. When I get on my left side, I can get a lot lower. My knees closer to the ground. I can feel more stretch through both the front and the back. So I have some significant imbalances in my hips related just to having multiple knee surgeries. All right, so now we're going to get up to our half kneeling position. So one foot's directly in front of the other. I want knee directly under hip, directly under shoulder, directly under head. Nice plumb line all the way down. Back toe is tucked and lightly loaded. And we're going to come back into pelvic tilts. Again, I want to work this front of the hip space because that's going to free up our low back. So getting a nice scoop in the pelvis so that we feel that light stretch through the front of the hip, and then anterior tilt. Feel the sway in the back. Exhale, scoop. Notice how the position of your pelvis impacts the position of your lumbar spine. As your pelvis goes anterior, you're getting a bigger lordotic curve in the front of the spine. This is the opposite direction that we're going to want when we get into our spinal rolls. However, when we scoop and we get long here, we're moving into that, we're losing that curve. That's our spine is getting a little bit more straight. That's that flexion mobility that we want to encourage in the low back. Notice how it's related to the movement of the pelvis. The tighter this is in the front, the harder it's going to be to get this to move in the back. We'll go ahead and switch and do the same thing on the other side. Again, super valuable to compare one side to the other. Because if you're feeling one side stiffer, that side that is stiffer is probably deviating your spine, not just forward, but a little bit towards that side hip, which again creates those curves. Not just a linear curve straight up and down, but it creates that scoliotic curve, which is normal across populations. Most people have some scoliotic curve. And continuing to bring in that crocodile breath aspect to this as well. The more you draw that navel into spine, is going to help draw that length through the front of the hip, and it's going to help encourage that core control so that we can maintain the low back. And we're kind of decoupling this relationship between tight hips and tight low back. And go ahead and switch back to the other side. We're going to do the same thing through the hips. Nice scoop, but now I want to draw that length upwards. So as I scoop, taking the same side hand and lifting up, and I want to feel that lift all the way up from my pelvis, from that scoop. Active scoop. As I lift, I want to feel that stretch, move with. Inhale, let it soften. Exhale, scoop with reach. Now, real important on this reach, I'm lifting my shoulder. I'm not dropping my opposite shoulder. I don't want to side bend if I can help it. I want to maintain this position, but I do want this shoulder to get taller. I'm kind of reaching down through this hip, so I'm getting length on one side of my spine, drawing this anterior compartment up without shortening on the other side. And we'll switch, do the same thing on the other side. Get that nice scoop and that active reach. Notice the difference. Notice where the difference is at. Do you feel it more at the hip, or maybe you feel it more at the shoulder? My left shoulder, which I noted was tighter in my baby rolls, feels tight and it feels like it's the restricted part of this movement. My hip feels okay. Once I add in the reach, that feels tight. These are important things because it could be the shoulder related to the hip, and then the hip is related to the back. And if you're addressing hip and back, and you don't address the shoulders, it's going to be a little bit incomplete. The shoulder's always going to be pulling things into a different level of tension That's going to prevent normal mobility of the area that we're focusing on. Go ahead and switch back to the other side. Now we're just going to simply cross our arms across chest. So as you scoop with arms crossed, we're turning our entire chest towards the wall of the leg in front of us. Seeing how far can you turn and rotate. Can you square your chest to the wall? Inhale, bring it back. Exhale, scoop and rotate. Now as I rotate, I don't want to lose my hips. I don't want my legs to roll out. I want to stay nice and solid here. If anything, I'm kind of counter-rotating. I have tension in my lower body moving that way as I move into it. Then we'll switch, do the same thing on the other side. Nice scoop and rotate. Oh, and this side's a little tighter. So notice if there's a different level of tension on one side compared to the other. I have a lot bigger stretch in the front of this hip when I apply rotation on this side compared to the other side. This is a big deal because, again, these are the kinds of tension patterns that pull on the spine and kind of bring the spine out of its alignment, especially the way our body perceives a neutral state of alignment. I am prone to getting nerve impingements in my low back. I've had it happen a couple of times in my life. This is one of the patterns that causes that. So I'm going to go ahead and bring it back to the other side again, and I want to do one more round of those, getting a nice rotation, but this time, instead of letting the eyes move with the shoulders, I want to find a fixed point on the horizon, on the wall in front, and maintain that point of contact with the eyes as you rotate. Everything else through the shoulders and the chest is the same. Inhale into that belly breath, exhale. Nice rotation. I'm getting a little bit of scoop in the pelvis as I rotate. And then same thing on the other side. Finding that nice scoop. Exhale, keeping the eyes fixed on the horizon. And just from going through this a second time, when I come back to this side that feels tighter, it's actually considerably more mobile than it was the first time. All right, so now we're going to get down into our quadruped. Nice spread fingers, palms grounded, elbows fully extended. We're going to do a little super light wrist mobility, just lightly rocking forwards and backwards, feeling into the wrist space to start with, just making sure that the wrists feel safe. There's not any major tension that we're noticing one side compared to the other. Once we feel nice and grounded through the wrists, through the palms, we're going to get a little spiral through the elbows, letting those elbow pits spiral forward and feeling the shoulder blades kind of pack down on the low back. And I want to hold that position through the shoulders, and we're coming back to our pelvis, doing pelvic scoops. I simply want to scoop the pelvis as far forward, tuck it underneath as much as I can so I start to feel some length, maybe stretch in the low back. And then letting the pelvis move forward. Belly opens up to the floor, getting this big sway in the back. I want to focus on that lumbar mobility now. We've got the hips loosened up a little bit. Now let's get the low back loosened up so that we can start playing with spinal rolls. Use the breath with this movement. Hips go forward, inhale into it. Feel that expansion of breath into your belly. Help pull your pelvis forward. On the exhale, drawing the navel into the spine. Feel that drawing in, add to your scoop. Can you feel that move into like a nice juicy stretch into that low back, or into the abdominal space of your breath. When you breathe in, can you feel it stretch the abdominals? When you scoop and exhale, can you feel it stretch your low back? And then let's go ahead and let this movement start to go up the rest of the spine. So as we scoop, start to move further into the cat, pushing into the floor. Feel that movement come through the shoulders, over the top of the head. And then we can find this point where middle, like we're trying to touch our tailbone to our forehead in this imaginary space in the middle. Can you reach and touch them together and feel your core light up on fire? And then inhale into this belly, feeling the pelvis wave all the way up towards the head. Exhale, same thing. Scoop, feel that nice wave-like action of the spine. All right, now we're going to change into laying on our back. And we're going to bring knees up nice and tight, and we're just going to start out with a nice little easy, happy baby. And we're going to work into some reverse rolls. This is to get partly working on mobilizing the low back, but at this point the low back's probably pretty well mobile. The next part of what I want to do is start to integrate our lower core into that mobility. So hands are on knees to start with. I want to come back into our breath. Inhale, feel that nice big balloon breath, opening up our abdominal space. On the exhale, drawing navel into spine. And as you're exhaling, pull the knees in. As you inhale, feel the knees move away just from that inflation of the abdominal space. With each exhale, pull the knees in a little tighter. Start to see if you can, as you exhale, let that belly press down into your lower back, into the floor, and start to feel your pelvis peel up off the floor. Part of that peeling up is from your hands assisting, but I really want to see how much can we peel the pelvis up off the floor from our exhale breath, that belly drawing in, that pulling through the belly is going to help to lift the pelvis off the floor. Can you start to do that more and more without your hands? In fact, at this point, let's bring our hands up overhead and let them rest comfortably on the floor. They need to be out to the side a good amount in order to get the elbows down, that's fine. The more overhead you can go, the better. As we inhale, letting that belly lift. Exhale, pressing the belly into the floor. See if you can start to peel the pelvis, the sacrum off the floor. Inhale, let it go forward. Exhale, see if you can lift a little higher. Now I only want to lift my hips up as high as I can without my arms and my head lifting off the floor. I want to be able to maintain soft contact of head and shoulders and arms as I'm slowly starting to peel. And we can continue to peel. If you're able to peel the sacrum up, can you peel the L5 off the floor? Can you peel the L4 off the floor? When you slowly start to peel your head, your hips over your head. Now, this needs to be slow. I don't want to use momentum. And I want to try to keep my knees tight as possible. I'm not letting my legs go straight. The focus here is more on lower core and less on how far we go. The more you work on this, eventually you'll be able to get into a position of like cloud, right? But I want to make sure that we get into that position with really good core control. So I'm not in a hurry to get to that end range. I'm more interested in developing the control through it right now. All right, so now we're going to sit up into an inverted position, bringing hands to the shins, and we're coming right back into our pelvic tilts. Pelvis is so much a part of this rolling pattern, and we'll get into the full roll here in just a few minutes. So, back into our breath. Inhale, filling up that abdominal space. Exhale, draw the navel to the spine and feel that scoop of the pelvis. Hands are on the shins because I want to prevent the shoulders from rocking back. I want to try to keep the shoulders directly over the hips. So as we inhale, filling up that belly, notice how it makes you sit nice and tall. As you exhale, we're allowing that scoop from the pelvis so that we're getting into this low back. I want to feel that stretch. Light stretch, does not need to be a massive stretch. Really, I want to feel it mobile more so than I want to feel it stretch. As you're getting into this, as you scoop, exhale drawing in, you can start to let your hands slide forward down your shins like you're trying to touch your toes at the same time that you're trying to scoop, and see if you can feel that nice stretch across the upper back. When you inhale, bring the hands back up as you get nice and tall. Exhale, scoop and reach. And now, if that's feeling pretty good, we're going to start working on a roll down and really seeing how low can you go on the roll down. So as we scoop, I want to see if we can continue to scoop and continue to scoop. There's a point where your hands are going to start sliding backwards. That's okay, but I want to continue to actively reach forward. That's going to help us get into that low back. Can you go down and just touch your sacrum flat to the floor? And then make it all the way back up. And can you do so without one or both feet lifting up? The feet are going to be the main thing here. If the feet lift up, then you're going too far. That means you don't have core control, and core control is what we're trying to develop. So the feet need to be in contact with the floor here. Seeing how low can you go, touching the sacrum and getting back up. That'll be the complete cycle of the movement. If you're able to touch the sacrum, can you touch your L5? And make it all the way back up. You can touch L5, can you touch L4? And so on. We're going to see if you can roll all the way down and then roll all the way back up without losing contact and without using momentum. The less momentum, the more you're using your core. No pain, super important. If you're only able to go down so far before your foot comes up, that just means that's your range of motion for right now. And that's what I want to work on that. I want to put in some quality reps up to that point because that's going to develop the core control that's going to slowly allow you to go further. So if you are able to roll down all the way through all the segments of the lower back, and you're able to do the reverse roll where you're able to lightly pick up the pelvis, you should be ready to start doing some full spinal rolls. Now, spinal rolls I want to make sure are very, very smooth and not clunky. So first I'm going to kind of show the spinal roll. There is a little bit of momentum, so this is a little bit of like feeling out the sequence of the movement. But everything else is the same. It's basically a roll down with a reverse roll. I want to feel that nice segmental movement through the spine. Each vertebrae touches the floor one at a time. Like I can feel each vertebrae connect, contact, release. What I don't want on this is clunk, where you feel multiple segments and you'll feel it. It's a big thud, part of your back, thuds on the floor. That means you don't have segmental control. That means you're doing this movement out of order. You haven't worked on it enough to get to that point. Work on the other progressions, you'll get here eventually. But if you can get into a spinal roll, this turns into a really lovely movement in and of itself. It works breath, it works mobility, it works core. It's also a transitionary movement to be able to roll smoothly through the spine and to come into other interesting positions, right? I want to have good access to quality movement. All right, let's go ahead and quickly come back into laying on our back. Now, coming back to our crocodile breath. Nice C-shaped hands, pressing in below the ribs, above the pelvis. That nice little squeeze. Again, index finger, side of the palm, and thumb. Pressing in so that we feel the abdominal walls of the front, side body, and the low back. As you exhale, drawing navel into spine, let your hands squeeze to create some resistance around the abdominal wall. And then as you inhale, bring the breath into that abdominal space and push out all 6 points of contact as evenly as you can. Notice where you breathe, where that breath comes in easier. Notice where it feels more difficult. In the area that feels more difficult and challenging, bring some focus of intention of that breath into that space. Notice if this feels a little easier than it did at the beginning of the class. Hopefully this is actually improved and you feel like you got greater expansion with better control. Next, we're going to let our arms soften, bring our knees up, feet touching, knees wide, hands on knees, pulling knees into our hands as we're pushing hands into the knee. Coming back to that same crocodile breath. Breathing in and expanding, exhale, drawing navel into spine, but maintaining this pressure of pulling and pushing through the knees and the hands. Make sure your shoulders are nice and soft and broad across the floor. Same thing with the low back. See if you feel your entire back, low back spread out on the floor as much as you can. And get 5 or 6 nice, full, deep breaths. We can bring our feet flat to the floor. Continue to breathe into that crocodile breath, but let it be a little softer now. As you inhale, breathe into the neck and shoulders and the ribs, feeling into any tension, any restriction. If you're feeling tension on the exhale, allow that tension to just get kind of released into the floor with each breath. And when you're ready, go ahead and open your eyes.